For my next real estate deal, I'm looking into partnering with a couple of guys. They have construction experience, and I have property management experience. Together, we would like to buy distressed multifamily properties, fix them up, and rent them out. So these discussions naturally brought up the question of what's the best structure to legally own these properties. And to help us figure out what to do, we met with a lawyer and an insurance agent and an accountant. And so I'd like to share what I learned. So there's three of us, and let's say there's three properties in this example. 1, 2, 3. The first idea was to put each property in its own LLC. I'm using LLCs as an example since that's what our lawyer suggested, but there are many options and you should talk to your own lawyer to figure out what's best in your situation. So each property is in its own LLC and each property has its own liability insurance. You could also substitute this for landlord's insurance if you want. The next part of this idea was to have each of those LLCs owned by a parent LLC, which we then owned. So the parent LLC would be a multi-member LLC, and the properties LLCs would be single-member LLCs. The parent company is that single member. That makes it so there are no extra tax consequences from the single members, and also, most importantly, clearly keeps everything separate. Of course, one obvious drawback to this plan is that it's complicated. So each LLC needs its own set of legal paperwork, its own legal fees, its own minutes taken. Furthermore, it keeps going. Each LLC needs to have a separate bank account. Each property's insurance would need to be paid from that property's LLC checking accounts. Even worse, if one property needed cash to do a large repair, like a roof repair, we would first need to disperse the cash to the parent LLC and then add that capital to the property that needed it. And we would need to make sure we document all of those moves because they're technically moving disbursements. Yeah, it's complicated, and this is probably the biggest reason why we didn't choose this idea. Of course, the other big reason why we didn't choose this was because there's also a question of whether or not the properties would actually be considered separate if they're owned by a parent LLC. So if one property goes down because we lost a suit, we didn't actually know what would happen with the other properties. So like in the state that I live in, they technically should be protected and considered separate, but there are no actual cases that have been argued in court to officially set the precedent yet. So given that the main reason why we wanted to keep everything separate, which is our protection, was in question, we moved on to a simpler structure. So there's three of us and three properties. 1, 2, 3. Each property still has its own liability insurance, but this time we skip straight to the multi-member LLC. You can already see this is simpler, but what do we do about the liability? Our recommendation was to get an umbrella policy that covered all of the properties. Now, one big caveat with this structure is that it assumes that we are playing by the rules and doing everything correctly. That way, if someone gets hurt, it wasn't because of negligence on our part. Since we strive to do everything legally and correct, and by the way, you should too, this wasn't a problem with us. Now, what's cool about this is if one property needed some cash, say for that new roof, it's easy because all the funds are in the same account. Even buying another property is easier because we can pool all the funds together without a huge audit trail being required. The biggest con that still remains, if we do get sued and lose or someone gets hurt, there's still a question of what would happen to the other properties and how much would the umbrella policy actually help. And unfortunately, we just don't know. So ultimately, there are two takeaways from what we learned. Number one, start simple at the beginning. If we want, we can get more complicated in the future and break the properties into separate LLCs with separate accounts and all of that. But if you only own a couple properties, keep it simple at first. And number two, strive to do everything legally correct. If maintenance needs to happen, do it. And if accounting and tools need to be separate, do it. That's actually the biggest thing you can do for your own protection. Thanks for watching.